EJ 125th anniversary session on cyclical variations in real wages, which in fact will be somewhat broader, be concerned with real wage dynamics, but also with business cycles. So this session here is sponsored by the ESRC Research Center on Center for Macroeconomics. My name is Morten Raven, and I'm one of the joint managing editors of the EJ, and I'm also the co-director of CFM, who is sponsoring this session. So I guess you've all seen the anniversary volume. So let me just first tell everybody that you should submit your best papers to the EJ, so you can get in the 2040 volume of the 100 best papers in the first 150 years next time round. So when we were planning this anniversary volume, of course, it was kind of impossible to get around having something on Keynes. So Keynes served as the editor of the EJ for no less than 32 years, and he was the second editor of the EJ, following Edgeworth. So it went a little bit downhill in the quality of the editors since then, but he was an important editor who used the EJ as an instrument for his own research agenda as well. And there's a lot of anecdotes about how he managed the EJ. And in fact, we went back to all the files of the EJ to find his. We were hoping to find his rejection letters and publish a few of those as well. But we couldn't actually find any, so we gave up on that. And what we decided instead was to have a session on the real weights and on business cycles. So during Keynes' 32 years in charge of the EJ, he also published various other things, including the general theory. And the general theory, when it came out, was subject, of course, to a lot of criticism and discussion. And it triggered off a number of submissions on various issues that were treated in the general theory, including there was a somewhat hot debate between Keynes and Pigou about whether there was a mistake in the general theory. Pigou at that point was actually a senior colleague of Keynes in Cambridge. But what we decided to go for instead is debate that I think is still actually very, very relevant, and that was about the Keynes's fears about the lack of adjustment of real wages over the business cycle, and how it relates to the relationship between money and real wages and the relationship to unemployment, of course, all of which matters a lot for business cycle fluctuations. So Keynes' views on this, they were challenged by empirical evidence, and there was a debate between Keynes, Dunlop, Tarshis, and other people that John Pencavel first will discuss. And as I say, that debate, I guess, ended up not having a real conclusion, and it's kind of come back now. We look at the Great Recession, we've seen real wages falling in the UK and flatlining in the US. So it's an evergreen topic. So the way this session is going to work is we're going to have 4 speakers. Each of them will have 20 minutes, and we'll leave around 10 minutes at the end of the session for questions. We'll start with John Pencavel, so he will reviews the debate following Keynes' theories. And then after that, we'll get some modern perspectives, first on real wages and then on business cycles. So first we'll have John, then we'll have Chris, then Larry, and then Ben after that. So let me hand over to John.
Thank you. So as Morten has said, my task is to summarize the debate that took place principally, but not exclusively, in the pages of the Economic Journal over real wages. And then I'm going to add a few comments of my own about more recent research. So if you look at the general theory towards the beginning of the book, Keynes encourages the statistical investigation, as he puts it, of 2 hypotheses about wages. Here is the first, that this dealt with changes in money wages and changes in real wages. And I like to quote him precisely, and you can see what he wrote. He wrote that in the case of changes in the general level of wages, when money wages are rising, real wages are falling. When money wages are falling, real wages are rising. That was his hypothesis. Now, when he made the statement on pages 9 and 10 of the general theory, he didn't explain why. But later, he does. It has to do with his claim, his hypothesis, that wages are more sticky than prices. So that in an expansion, when prices are tending to rise, wages are also rising, but not as much. Hence, when money wages are rising in an expansion, they're not rising as much as prices, hence, real wages are falling. Conversely, in a contraction, where there's a tendency for prices to be declining, to fall, wages also tend to fall, but not as much. They're stickier than prices. Hence, there is a negative correlation due to this relative stickiness. There's a negative correlation between movements in real wages and movements in money wages. That was his first, the first hypothesis that he threw out, and he encouraged its statistical examination. His next hypothesis, just a few pages later, dealt with changes in real wages and in employment. Now, I want to note here, it's going to come up perhaps a little bit later, Keynes was a true neoclassical economist in believing that wages were set such that real wages equals the value of marginal product. He took employers, the demand curve of employers, as pretty much as Marshall characterized it. Hence, now note the caveat in the beginning, with a given organization, equipment and technique, in other words, holding other things constant, real wages and the volume of output and employment are uniquely correlated so that, in general, an increase in employment can only occur to the accompaniment of a decline in the rate of real wages. The real wage has a unique inverse correlation with the volume of employment. And indeed, this correlation traces out firms' labor demand functions. This hypothesis was resurrected in this country, in England, in Britain, in the 1980s, when unemployment rose and persisted. And the popular hypothesis that was put out at that time, this persistence in unemployment, this relatively low level of employment, was because real wages were not falling. If you want to increase employment, it was argued at the time, you need to lower real wages. That's fully consistent with the general theory. What followed this statement in the general theory? A whole string of articles. Dunlop in the Economic Journal, Tarshis in the Economic Journal, Richardson in the Economic Journal, Dunlop in the RES, and finally, not finally, but subsequent to the Tarshis and Dunlop articles, Keynes responded. You'll see that I've listed, there was a lot of articles, I've listed a subset here. You'll see that Dunlop appears more than anybody else Dunlop, an American who was trained at Berkeley, came to Cambridge in the 1930s, did a huge amount of research on labor markets and movements in wages. And some of the papers of his are really quite remarkable. For example, the paper by Dunlop in the RES, the Review of Economic Studies, the title of that paper is, "Has the rigidity of money wages increased over time?" And he pieced together a lot of data to address that. What's remarkable about that paper is that it contains, 2 decades later, Phillips' curve. He relates both the level of wages, money wages, and the rate of change of wages to the unemployment rate in the years before the 1930s. It doesn't seem widely recognized that Dunlop had done this, and when Phillips, of course, published his paper in the late 1950s, it bore Phillips' name, Phillips's curve. But some of these papers contain a wealth of information. Dunlop, in fact, concluded his research on this topic by writing a really path-breaking book. In the literature on trade unions, this book is truly path-breaking. Why? Because he made the statement and tried to correct that a fault in labor economics was that there was no behavioral model of the union. Dunlop proposed, in other words, that like the firm, the union has an objective function and it does the best subject to constraints. Now, the particular objective he gave was not very plausible, the wage bill. But subsequent work has generalized his objectives. It was truly an original book. And it came out of this debate with Keynes and others. I say others because also you can see an article there by Dunlop in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. This debate went over to the Atlantic with articles in the Quarterly Journal of Economics out of Harvard, so that this debate involved a very lot of figures, people doing a lot of work. The conclusion of these people can be summarized with the statements here. Note that I've written down here product wages and consumption wages, and wages and earnings. The trouble with, for the Keynes's critics, is that Keynes isn't very precise about what he really means. When he means real wages, does he mean wages divided by the consumer price index, which matters to workers, the consumption wage? Or does he mean the product wage, the wage divided by the price of employers' outputs? Well, he subsequently made it clear in his response he meant the latter. He was talking about the price, the real wage as it looks to the employer. But nevertheless, for the critics, it wasn't easy to see exactly what, it wasn't clear what Keynes meant. Nor did he mean wage rates, or did he mean that what might have been negotiated between employers and employees, or did he mean the actual earnings that would be affected by overtime, for instance? Again, Keynes subsequently made it clear he meant wage rates. Nevertheless, all these things impede the assessment. What was the judgment? Well, Tarshish, by the way, was a Canadian who was spending some years at Cambridge. And when he went back to the US, he wrote a very popular introductory economics textbook that was fully Keynesian. It was displaced after a few years by Samuelson's Economics. But initially, for a while, Tarsh's book dominated the introductory economics curriculum, dominated so much that shortly after, Tarshis was the subject of accusations by Senator Joe McCarthy that Tarshis was bringing socialism and communism to America. How did Keynes respond? Well, Keynes's response was not a frank, yes, I was wrong, or no, I was right. He drew upon more statistical work, this time by James Mead in the League of Nations World Survey, that were consistent with what he initially proposed. But it's not, in my judgment, it's not a very convincing response. Indeed, what I've done here is I've quoted what is the most striking statement in this response, one that's been quoted a number of times, but in a response that's rather mild and insipid. Here is what he said about one topic that doesn't come up in the general theory at all. One of the most surprising yet least established facts in the whole range of economic statistics is the stability in the proportion of the national dividend accruing to labor. Regardless of the phase of the trade cycle, it's a bit of a miracle. Why is it so stable? But I don't quite understand Keynes's surprise. Why not? Well, remember that Keynes was a believer in the neoclassical notion that real wages equal the value of marginal product of labor. Well, given that, here I've written down in S, labor's share. That's the wage payments times employment or worker hours. That's the numerator. And the denominator, national income, prices times national output. Taken logarithms, then interpret little d as the change in the log. Then the change in the log of labour share is what? Is the change in the real wage less the change in the average product of labour. So labour share will not change when real wages increase along with the average product of labour. Well, Keynes assumed that real wages equal the marginal product of labour. So if the marginal product of labour and the average product of labour are proportional to one another, as they, well, close to proportional, move together, then if Keynes is right in believing that real wages equal the marginal product of labour, then at all times, then labour's share should be a constant. It should not change. So it's a strong statement that's been made many times, but it's one that I've not quite understood why Keynes was so surprised. Yes, one thing about when one reads Keynes, when one reads the general theory, one is struck by the fact that there's little behaviour when it comes to workers in the general theory. For example, he made the statement, the following statements: every trade union will put up a resistance to a cut in money wages, however small. Well, to start with, that's not true. In recent years, back in the 19th century, if unions were convinced that a cut in wages would save employment, save jobs, they were willing to go along with the cut. So it's not true that they always put up a resistance to a drop in money wages. But no union, he wrote, would dream of striking on every occasion of a rise in the cost of living. What Dunlop showed, in fact, that unions were very sensitive to movements in the cost of living. So much so, Dunlop showed, that there were cases where the unions asked for cost of living clauses to be put into understandings between the employer and the union. So reading it today, I tend to think that the labour market features of the general theory are not his strongest elements. So even though Keynes's hypotheses seem to be refuted, the topic of the cyclical movement of real wages became a topic of a large amount, a voluminous amount of research. The way I read the macroeconomic literature, I don't believe that there is a consistent empirical regularity. That sometimes real wages seem to be, or in some countries, or in some periods, real wages seem to move pro-cyclically, and in other countries and in other times, contra-cyclically. So I don't believe there's a pattern there, and even when there has been a claim to be a pattern, the results have shown to be fragile or frankly wrong. I mean, there was a very influential paper published by Tom Sargent in the late 1970s, where using lags in real wages, movements of employment did seem to be negatively correlated with the lag values of real wages. But then just a few years later, Geary and Kennan showed that, that just by replacing the deflator in the definition of real wages, you get completely opposite results. In other words, Sargent used the consumer price index to deflate wages, even though for a labour demand curve, you would think that the product, the producer price index would be more appropriate. And when Geary and Kennan did that, sure enough, Sargent's results went away. I see no robust association between real wages and output over the business cycle. There's a macroeconomic research that looks at movements in real wages of the same workers, longitudinal data, over time. Now, that's important because in a recession, low-wage workers tend to lose their jobs first, so that there's a compositional change in the aggregate wage rate due to the unemployment of low-wage workers. But when you remove these things, these effects, there is mild pro-cyclicality. That is, real wages tend to rise when output is rising and contract when output employment is falling. But it's mild, it's not a strong result. Let me just say something about rigidity, and then I'll stop. On rigidity in modern research, what microeconomists have done, again, they've followed the same workers over time, longitudinal data, and they've made a frequency distribution of how many workers receive zero money wage increases, how many workers receive large or small, positive or negative. Well, what they show very clearly is a big spike at zero. But that spike is indeed higher, that zero change, in a recession than in a boom. There's a lot of work suggesting that indeed money wages are sticky. But there's also a lot of work suggesting product prices are sticky. And Keynes' statement was a statement not simply that money wages are sticky, but they're more sticky than prices. And again, I'm not sure that that's been demonstrated. Okay, I think I'd better stop to allow others to say something.
Okay, thanks for having us out to present this paper. It's entitled Unemployment Fluctuations, Match Quality, and the Wage Cyclicality of New Hires. It's joint work with Mark Gertler and Antonella Trigari, who's here. So what are we going to do in this paper? We're going to present new empirical evidence on the cyclical behavior of the wages of new hires. I should step away from that. And in particular, we're going to argue that evidence that's been interpreted as supporting perfect flexibility in the wages of new hires, in fact, represents cyclical upgrading in workers changing jobs. We're going to develop a model of equilibrium unemployment with staggered Nash bargaining, idiosyncratic match quality, and on-the-job search. But importantly, no wage flexibility for new hires. So when we simulate our model, we're going to generate empirical evidence that looks like what's found in the data. So it's going to look like new hires have greater wage flexibility than continuing workers. But in fact, it's going to be entirely due to job changers who find better matches during expansions than during recessions. So why are we doing this? So there's a rich tradition within the macroeconomic literature of incorporating some form of wage rigidity to help bring models closer to replicating cyclical regularities in the labor market. So this is true of the recent vintage of DSGE models. It's also become true within the search and matching literature with the so-called unemployment volatility puzzle identified in Scheimer 2005. So in 2009, Pissarides publishes a paper that offers a powerful critique of this approach. So the justification of adding wage rigidity to a macroeconomic model is based on the observation that in the aggregate, wages are not very flexible. But what Pissarides argues is that really the wage that we should be looking at is the wage of newly hired workers, which needs to be disentangled from the aggregate data. So drawing on existing studies from panel data, Pissarides offers an interpretation that indeed the wages of new hires are perfectly flexible with productivity. And so this calls into question much of the research which has incorporated some form of wage rigidity at the extensive margin of hiring to produce more realistic cyclical volatility. And also that the justification of wage rigidity based on the behavior of aggregate wages is misplaced. Okay, so what's our take on this? Our take on this is that the evidence cited by Pissarides, in fact, reflects compositional changes in the labor force. So the typical regression from the literature estimates the wage cyclicality of new hires from two distinct populations. So one are new hires from unemployment. The second are new hires coming from other jobs, so job-to-job changers. So why might this be important? So job-to-job changes there's an extensive literature documenting that job-to-job changes are an important source of wage growth for workers. And then there's a theoretical literature arguing that workers have an easier time finding a better job during expansions, and they move to these jobs at a faster rate. So this implies that there's actually a new hire effect present in the data, but it's not necessarily being driven by a contractual flexibility with new hires, but instead by a composition effect of workers searching on the job, finding better jobs during expansions. So the implication is that the contractual new hire effect argued for by Pissarides is mixed with the new hire effect that's due to changes in the composition of jobs. And so and the two effects are confounded in the data. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to construct a new panel data set from the Survey of Income and Program Participation. And it's going to allow us to sharply distinguish between workers who find jobs while employed and workers who find jobs from unemployment. So we're going to do two things. First, we're going to show that if we estimate the typical regression from the literature, we recover a substantial new hire effect. That is, that new hire wages appear to be far more flexible than the wages of existing workers. But when we estimate separate cyclical responses from new hires from unemployment and new hires from other jobs, we recover no evidence of new hire wage flexibility among workers from unemployment, but substantial cyclicality for workers coming from other jobs, which we interpret to be indicative of pro-cyclical changes in match quality over the business cycle. So to interpret this evidence, we're going to develop a search and matching model with the Gertler-Trigari staggered Nash bargaining on the job search and heterogeneity and match quality. So first, we're going to test the model's ability to match aggregate labor market data. But then we're going to see whether our model is able to match as an outcome the elasticities of wages that we see in the data. And we're going to find that indeed it does. And we'll show that if you were to take simulated data from our model and apply the typical regression from the literature, you would find evidence of flexibility of wages for new hires, even though in the model there is none. Okay, so as I said, our data comes from the Survey of Income and Program Participation. So the important thing about this data is that it's large, it's representative, and it follows multiple cohorts. So we have data from 1990 through, I believe, the beginning of 2014. There are interviews every 4 months, and from this we can back out the pattern of job transitions within a 4-month period and distinguish very sharply between workers who switch jobs with no intervening period of non-employment and workers who switch jobs with some intervening period of non-employment. Oops, sorry. Okay, so here we're going to show you the existing econometric framework referred to by Pissarides and developed by Mark Bills in a 1985 paper. So essentially, this is a modified, an augmented Mincer wage regression. We have the log real wage on the left-hand side, controls for individual characteristics, but then 3 additional terms. So one is a cyclical indicator, which is typically taken as the unemployment rate. The other is an interaction between that identifies a separate wage cyclicality for new hires on the jobs. So it's an interaction between the new hire dummy and the unemployment rate. And then the third is, actually the third is right here, it's a new hire dummy. So the interpretation is that for continuing workers, the regression coefficient pi u reveals the semi-elasticity of wages with respect to unemployment. But for new hires, the semi-elasticity of wages with respect to unemployment are the sum of pi u and pi nu. So a robust finding from this literature is that indeed pi nu is substantially negative and significant, indicating that decreases in the unemployment rate are associated with large increases in wages for new hires. So Pissarades develops an argument where he takes estimates from the existing literatures and shows that this is in fact consistent with a model of Nash bargaining with wages that move one-for-one with productivity. So our two observations are that first, the new hire interaction term does not vary by the type of new hire, whether the new hire comes from unemployment or from another job. And second, there's unobserved match quality. While this equation is usually estimated in first differences or in fixed effects, and so unobserved permanent heterogeneity associated with the worker is taken into account, unobserved match quality is not. So here we show that we can replicate the Bill style of regression that is prominent in the literature. So this is in fixed effects and in first differences. So you see that compared to existing workers, new hires have substantially more cyclical wages. So in first differences, the semi-elasticity of wages is about 0.45. For new hires, it's the sum of 0.45 and 1. So the significance of this row means that there's substantial flexibility for new hires. Okay, so our econometric framework follows Bill's almost to the T, except for one difference. We estimate separate semi-elasticities for workers who find jobs from unemployment and workers who find jobs from other jobs. So we adopt several measures of distinguishing these two types of workers from the data for robustness. So here's the slide in fixed effects. So here's the interaction term for workers making job-to-job transitions. You see that there's evidence of very large in magnitude cyclicality for new hires making job-to-job transitions. But for new hires from unemployment, there's no evidence of extra wage cyclicality. You see this both in the levels of the coefficients. Oh, I mean, it's driven by smaller coefficients on the interaction term. And we're able to reject the null hypothesis that these two coefficients are in fact the same. So what's going on here? So as I noted before, the typical regression is able to account for time invariant unobserved components of an individual's wage. But when we're talking about job changers over the business cycle, we're talking about people who move to higher quality jobs when the unemployment rate's falling. What's that mean? It means that the covariance between the component of the error term that reflects the quality of the job and the change in the unemployment rate is negatively correlated. So this is going to generate bias in the regression I just showed you. So we take this as evidence that there's no new hire wage cyclicality in the channel that really matters, which is new hires from unemployment, but that there's substantial evidence for pro-cyclical match grading for job changers. So we're going to take our estimates and view them as conditional moments that we will interpret in terms of an equilibrium model. So we're going to be working in a real business cycle laboratory with search and matching, perfect consumption insurance, and basically following the Mertz-Fado framework. We have essentially three variations. First is staggered Nash bargaining, which generates some wage inertia, but also implies that new hires receive wages that are no more flexible than those of continuing workers. But then we also introduce a rule for match composition on the job search. So the key is there's no new higher wage flexibility, but we're going to evaluate the model's ability to match the macro labor market moments, but also the moments implied by our model. So the test of our model is whether it's able to replicate the tables I just showed you just from this compositional component. Okay, so the basic framework is that it's a model of random search, and there are two kinds of matches within the firm. There are good matches and there are bad matches. Bad matches are less productive, but the labor effort that they offer is perfectly substitutable with good matches. Firms and workers only realize whether a match is good or bad after they meet each other. Okay, so we have three populations of searchers in this model. The first is standard, searchers from unemployment, and the second are searchers who are searching on the job. So we have bad workers, denoted by B, searching with variable search intensity, and then also following the literature, finding that, in fact, many on-the-job changes are not accompanied by an appreciable wage increase. We have good workers searching with fixed search intensity. We also allow workers who are separated within the period to search. The only other thing that's non-standard is the acceptance rule that will be implied is that good and bad workers will only move to good matches. So firms choose hiring and capital renting to maximize the value of discounted profits. They have to keep track of they operate subject to the law of motion of the labor force and the composition of good and bad workers within the firm. And then from this, we derive an optimal hiring and capital rental decision. So we have value functions for unemployed workers and for bad workers and good workers. The only thing I'll remark on this is that we derive these so that we can derive the optimal search decision of bad workers, which is going to be a key force in the model, and also the value function of good workers is going to be important for wage negotiation. So workers in bad matches choose their search intensity to maximize their present value. And we assume that there's a convex search cost. So from this, we derive a first-order condition determining the search intensity of workers in bad matches. And the key thing to note is that, as is suggested in the literature, search intensity is increasing in the probability of finding a job. So workers in bad matches increase their search intensity during good times. So wages are determined by staggered Nash bargaining, which means they're not renegotiated each period, but firms and workers take into account the fact that they might not be renegotiated. The firms and good workers are negotiating over the price of per unit of labor quality. Bad workers receive a wage within the firm that's commensurate with their productivity. The key thing here is that there's no extra wage flexibility for new hires. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. So our calibration is standard, except we have one additional parameter, which is the renegotiation frequency of wages, which we set to be 4 quarters. We have a variety of moments that we have to internally calibrate. The key thing here is that we try to match, the average wage gain of job changers and the average wage loss of people moving from employment to unemployment to back to employment. So this slide just tells you that the addition of search on the job and variable match quality does not affect the ability of the staggered Nash bargaining model to generate aggregate moments that are similar to what we see in the data. So here is our model with staggered renegotiation. We have reasonable unemployment volatilities and wage volatilities. Here is the economy with period-by-period negotiation. So this slide is the real test of the model. So here we take the model and we simulate data, and then we perform the types of regressions in the literature on the simulated data. So from the survey of income and program participation, we find that continuing workers have some elasticity of wages equal to about 0.4. For new hires, it's about minus 1.5. Here, from the model, we generate basically virtually the same results. But the important thing is that we have no new hire wage flexibility in the model. But if you were to come to this model without controlling for composition, you would conclude that there indeed was new hire wage flexibility. Just to point out, when we look at flexible wage models, the numbers are way off. There's far too much wage volatility. There's not enough inertia in wages. So I'm going to skip this, but so to conclude, we're offering evidence that indeed, actually, new hire wages are no more flexible than those of continuing workers. And we did this based off of an analysis of a new panel data set, and we separate new hires coming from unemployment and new workers coming from another job. Then we, to account for our data, our results, we developed a model of unemployment fluctuations with wage rigidity and on-the-job search. And so what we find is that the model is consistent with both the macro and the micro level evidence, and that all the additional ingredients that we brought to the model were necessary to explain these two sets of evidence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me to do this presentation. This is with Marty Eichenbaum and Matthias Trabant. Oops, sorry. Let me start with the background here. What we've seen in the US since 2008 was a substantial and apparently permanent drop in GDP. The labor force participation rate, which usually has been falling a lot, and usually it kind of recovers a little bit during an expansion. Actually, during the official end to the recession recently, the labor force participation rate only fell even faster. During the recession, the unemployment rate went up, of course, as it always does. It went up very persistently and very high. And then it started going down, but with the fall in the unemployment rate was not an indicator that the labor market was performing more efficiently, I don't think. It primarily reflected the fall in labor force participation. The unemployment rate's coming down primarily because people are not looking for work anymore. Vacancies, which of course plunged during the recession, they kind of bounced back after 2009. But unemployment rates came down very slowly. The job finding rate rose very slowly, and that made people think there was something wrong with the labor market. This is sometimes referred to as the mismatch hypothesis, is based on this observation. Also, it's referred to as the shift in the beverage curve. Of course, investment and consumption were weak, continue to be weak, and finally, during the last few years, inflation fell, but seemingly very little given the tremendous drop in economic activity. This is the background for this paper, and it motivates these questions that we ask in the paper. What were the forces driving all this stuff? Is there some breakdown in the relationships in the labor market? Is there mismatch in the labor market? And why was the drop in inflation so moderate? Here the answer is, or here's the model that we think we need to ask these questions. We obviously need something that has a lot to do with labor markets. we need to be able to say something about labor force participation. We have to be able to say something about unemployment, something about the job finding rate, the vacancies. We need a model of this sort. In addition, of course, we also need output and consumption and stuff, but we need a big labor market sort of thing. So the novel aspects of the model that we're going to use here have to do with the labor market. And in particular, we're going to endogenize labor force participation. And another thing that we do is we need any macroeconomist who wants to study the macroeconomy has to have some kind of wage rigidity in the model. But what we're going to do is we're going to work with a model where the wage rigidity is an endogenous feature of the model. It is not imposed in any way by some assumption of wage setting frictions or something of that sort. The wage rigidity will come out as an equilibrium outcome here. We're going to estimate the model up through 2008, the period before these background observations. We're going to get the parameters of the model based on that early period. And then what we're going to do is look at the period that interests us, post-2008, and ask if we can, well, what are the answers to these questions that I described before. So we're going to, using this pre-2008 model, we're going to analyze the post-2008 data. So the questions and then the answers that we come up with. The questions, what are the forces that drove the real quantities in the Great Recession? Well, in the analysis, we allow for four forces, I guess 4 shocks. And the financial market shocks are the key drivers. And they also drive the labor force participation rate. Basically, what these shocks do is they make the labor market look unappealing, and that's why the labor force participation rate in the model is endogenously low. We were a little bit surprised by this result because there's a fair amount of movement in government spending in the United States during this period, and we were surprised to find that government spending shocks don't play a role at all in the dynamics of the data, in answering any of these questions that I put up before. There's quite a bit of discussion in this paper, and in particular, we stress how the notion that the government shocks are not important is perfectly consistent with, oh my God, wait, it's on over here. If you can all crowd around, oh, there, okay. So this finding that government shocks are not important is perfectly consistent with the zero lower bound literature, which looks like it suggests government spending shocks should be hugely important. Our conclusion we discuss in relation to the zero lower bound kind of stuff, and we explain. I'm not going to do that here, but we explain how this finding could be consistent with this literature. We ask another question is, can we understand what happened in the last few years without resorting to mismatch in the labor market? And the answer is yes. We don't have, in our model, there's no structural shift in the labor market, and we have no problem accounting for this apparent evidence, for example, of a shift in the Beveridge curve and all those sorts of things. So that's the basis for this conclusion that a mismatch in the labor market we don't think is a first order aspect of what happened in the last few years. I said this a moment ago, the labor force participation rate, for example, reflects mainly the response of people to a lousy labor market. In particular, in the case of the Beveridge curve, we find that this evidence, the empirical evidence that the Beveridge curve shifted, is not at all inconsistent with the theory. And the reason is that the typical theoretical Beveridge curve is a steady state phenomenon. It doesn't apply at all to dynamics in a business cycle. In our model here, where the steady state Beveridge curve is a single line up and down, our model predicts exactly the kind of cycling behavior that we saw in the data. So there is no reason to see this apparent shift in the Beveridge curve as indicating some kind of breakdown in the labor market. Another question was why was the drop in inflation so moderate? And our answer to that is two things. Two things during this period kept costs kind of high, and other things the same. Of course, that pushes inflation up. So there were these two factors that caused inflation drop to be so moderate. One of them is the big drop in TFP growth that occurred during this period. TFP growth drops substantially. It also seems to have a trend decline, but it drops substantially during the recession. Of course, other things the same. That raises costs and puts upward pressure on inflation. The other thing is that, and many people have written about this, in the model we make the assumption that firms have to borrow in order to pay for their variable inputs. And we suppose that they have to borrow at the risky interest rate, as is the case actually for firms. In the data, you see big increase in interest rate spreads, and in the model, that's interpreted as a big increase in the cost of borrowing for working capital. These two forces place upward pressure on prices and inflation, and our model's explanation for why the drop in inflation was so moderate. Let me do the quick outline here. I'm going to give you a very crude outline of the model, very rough description of the results. Basically, I already gave you that, but I'll say a couple of other things, and of course, the details are all in the paper. So let me talk about the labor markets. In order to talk about labor force participation, we have to deviate from the usual two-state model of the labor market. We have to go to 3 states. So we have a 3-state model. You can be working, you can be non-participating, and you can be unemployed. And we have flows going between all of those things. The gross flows we show in the paper are roughly, in our model, roughly correspond to the gross flows in the actual data. The gross flows are huge between all these categories. There are two basic forces in the labor market that are kind of, I guess, novel in this paper. One is the endogeneity of the labor force participation rate, and the other one has to do with how do we get wages to be kind of sticky or something. So here's the endogeneity of the labor force participation rate. We have a large family, like there was in the previous paper, and this is the typical family's utility function. And the utility function shows that C tilde, which is sort of actual consumption, is produced using market consumption and using activity in the home, CTH. And the activity in the home is produced by the people who are not in the labor force, 1 minus LT. And the household has preferences across those two things. Then the budget constraints gives them financial opportunities for substituting between those two things, which have to do with what is the wage rate, what are the payments for unemployment benefits, and those other factors that are in there. So what this household does is it looks at what the opportunities look like in the labor market. It looks at how things seem at home, and then takes preferences into account, and then optimally chooses how many people to kick out of the house to find a job. Of course, when wages go down, or if the job finding rate goes down, then the labor market's relatively less attractive, and you'll find the labor force participation rate going down in the model. The second thing that's going on in this analysis here is how are the wages set in the model? Well, for that, we have the wages set by bargaining, and bargaining is occurring between various types of people. People who go from non-participation rate and are lucky and they find their way directly to employment, they're bargaining with the firm. People who are going from employment to employment on the job transitions, they're bargaining with firms. And then people who go from unemployment up there, they're bargaining. Bunches of different people are bargaining with firms. And what we do in this model to get wages not to move around too much, is we use a modified version of the proposal that Hall and Milgram made a few years ago. And in particular, they describe a bargaining scenario between workers and firms that has the property that, I can't go into the details about this, but it has the property that the outcome of the bargaining, the outcome of the bargaining is the wage, of course, and the sensitivity of the wage to the outside general business conditions is modified somewhat. Not entirely, because we want wages to be pro-cyclical. We want to see wages moving around, but we don't want them to see them moving around as much as they would in a spot market environment. So this is the basic idea that they have. And then what we find is that if we throw a shock at our model that launches an expansion in the economy, what we find is that endogenously the equilibrium of the model has the property that wages don't rise very rapidly, and because of that the firms get a large portion of the rent associated with hiring a person, so that when this expansionary shock is launched, firms have a lot of incentive to post vacancies, to go out and get people, and you get a big expansion in employment. And we spent some time talking about, in terms of our pre-2008 analysis, estimates of how the economy responds to shocks, and arguing that our model reproduces those responses nicely. For example, there's no Scheimer puzzle in this model. The response of finding rate and vacancy rate and unemployment rate and all that labor market stuff to shocks in our model kind of resembles what we see in the data. Now what we do is we take this labor market thing and we load it into kind of a standard medium-sized model, because we want to take this thing, we want to go look at, see if we can understand the post-2008 data. So we have sort of all these various features that are in a standard medium-sized, so-called medium-sized model. We have our labor market structure in there. And then we have an estimation strategy for the pre-2008 data, which is that we try to get the model to mimic the estimated response to shocks in the data. And so that gives us our parameters. We argue the model does pretty well too on this dimension. Anyway, we do that in the paper. Okay, so now we get to the question that we're trying to address, which is, can we explain some of these facts that we observed about the U.S. Great Recession? Well, the U.S. Great Recession is a lot of things. The questions we ask involve a lot of variables, and they're kind of all the variables. You can see GDP way up there on the top left. Per capita GDP plunges. You know, it never seems to come back again. It looks like it's like permanently 10% below some kind of a trend you might have drawn through the previous data. You can see here the vacancy rate plunges and then seems to bounce back right away, but the unemployment rate comes down very slowly. That's the top right. And the job finding rate is coming back very slowly too. That's the shift. That's the apparent shift in the Beveridge curve that led a lot of people think that there was some kind of a breakdown, that what was driving all this stuff was some kind of a breakdown in the labor market. You can see the interest rate spread over here in the bottom right, and that's something that we're going to take. We're going to take that straight from the data, and we're going to use that to calculate one of our shocks. Actually, as I said, we're going to allow 4 shocks to possibly explain the dynamics of the data, and all 4 of those shocks we're going to go to the data directly and measure them. We're not going to treat them as unobserved variables, we're going to treat them as observed variables. So for example, we're going to include that interest rate spread over there. We're going to include the observed TFP. You can see the drop in TFP over there. We're going to include that as a shock. In addition, there's government spending. We're going to include that, and there's one more that I haven't told you about, but that's also going to be measured based on data. So what we do is, if we want to explain the Great Recession, we have to say kind of what it is. And a lot of what happened to the data was just the unfolding of what was happening before. So to define the Great Recession, we really need to have what the data would have been in the absence of whatever the Great Recession was about, relative to what the Great Recession was about. We need that. Now the problem is it's not clear how to compute a trend. So we compute the trend using a million different ways. And the trend, that is the thing that would have happened absent the Great Recession. That's what I'm calling the trend. We take that trend, and then we take the difference between the trend and the blue line, and that's our target. That's what we're trying to understand. Now, there are many ways of calculating the trend, and so you see those gray areas cover all of our many different ways of calculating the trend. It's kind of a measure of uncertainty about the trend, and that's expressed in terms of differences with the actual. So you can see the top left, GDP is coming down to minus 10% or so. That's what we call, that's our definition of the Great Recession. It's not a very precise definition because we don't know exactly how to calculate the trend, but the gray area gives you kind of our definition. That's our target, what we're trying to see if we can understand. So we have 4 shocks, 2 financial shocks, a TFP shock, a government spending shock. We get all the shocks from the data, so we limit our degrees of freedom that way, but there's one degree of freedom that we do have, and I don't know how we can get rid of it, because agents in the model, we can't have people have perfect foresight. It may be okay for 1 year, 2 years, but not for 6, 7 years. You can't have perfect foresight. So we need these agents to be looking at the data and then forecasting what it's going to look like, which means we need time series representations for these 4 shocks, so that we do have to make up. There's a feature of this thing that what we ideally would have liked to have done was just take 4 shocks and then shove them through the model and see what the model says. That's not quite possible. We have to make an assumption about what people think the time series representation is from which those shocks are drawn. There's a big complication in modeling this period, which has to do with monetary policy. Monetary policy is a seriously complicated situation. From 2008 to 2011, it looks to us, and we model it that way, as a Taylor rule, with a non-negativity constraint on the interest rate, which of course becomes binding. But then after that, it gets seriously interesting. It's called the Evans rule. And the policy is something like, we're going to keep the interest rate at 0 until the unemployment rate comes down to 6.5%, or the inflation rate comes up to 2.5%. And if either of those 2 conditions exist, then we're going to switch back to the Taylor rule. That's how we model that. That's an unbelievably nonlinear thing. And so part of this project is working with nonlinear model simulation, stochastic simulation methods, and that's one of the things we're excited about here. There have been huge progress on this dimension in recent years because nonlinearities are a big feature of the data, and we're involved in that here. So let me skip this slide here, and I'll just say that there are our targets, and we push the 4 shocks through the model, and the blue line is what we get. And you can see we can roughly replicate the actual, what actually happened. The blue line is kind of inside all of those gray areas. We're also forecasting stuff a little bit later. The forecasts, this is from 2013, actually are not that unlike the actual data, though I don't have the actual data up there. So now I have a model which can kind of explain what happened, and I can ask this model, okay, you seem to understand the data, Mr. Model. What is your answer to the question about why inflation didn't fall very much? See, the model is able to explain the lack of a dramatic fall in inflation. It also can explain the fall in output, and so on. And so what the model is saying, what the model tells us is the following, that the financial shocks are accounting primarily for everything, even the labor market, because the financial shocks are damaging aggregate demand in the model, and that demand is causing the labor market to deteriorate and make it unattractive to the households. And we get the other answers that I mentioned before in this way. So let me conclude now. According to this analysis here, most of the economic activity during this Great Recession reflected these 4 shocks colliding actually with the 0 lower bound on the nominal interest rate. And in this model, we do have, it's a new Keynesian model, so it has sticky prices in it, but there are no sticky wages. It's inertial behavior of the wages that you have to have if you're going to understand the data emerges endogenously here. What we find is no evidence or little evidence for mismatch in, I don't know, no, not little, just no evidence for mismatch in the labor market, and the modest fall in inflation is not a puzzle from this point, from the perspective of this framework, once you take into account the big drop of TFP and the rising costs of borrowing, at least that existed during 2009. They were not so big after 2009. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well first just let me thank the organizers for having us. It's a real pleasure to be able to present joint work with Larry Christiano and Marty Eichenbaum. Before I start, I should say that the views expressed here are my own and not those of the Board of Governors, the FOMC, or anyone else in the Federal Reserve System. So the title of my talk today is going to be, Does the New Keynesian Model Have a Uniqueness Problem? And the reason that that's an interesting question to us, at least, is that the more we look at these macroeconomic models like the one Larry just talked about, the more equilibria we seem to find in these models. And that's a huge problem because analyses inevitably involve an equilibrium selection in order to be able to make progress on things like the size of the government spending multiplier or the cyclicality of real wages. And so we need some way to be able to figure out this multiplicity issue. So for the purposes of the talk today, I'm going to focus on the zero lower bound. And we're going to follow a model that was really sort of introduced by Egerton and Woodford and Krugman that launched a literature on analyses of the new Keynesian model when the nominal interest rate is at its effective lower bound. As Larry pointed out, it has been since late 2008. So this model is important because it's a very small model that we consider in the paper, but it lies at the core of the way that many people think about the events of recent years, and also the way that many people think about the appropriate policy response to a zero lower bound episode. And what we're going to do is we're going to adopt some of the really clever assumptions in the literature from Egerton and Woodford that allow us to consider equilibria in which economic variables are going to be constant at the zero lower bound, and then they're going to jump to a particular steady state after the zero lower bound is over. And I hope what this will let me do is illuminate the multiplicity issue and also how we think we can select among equilibria. So this literature on the zero lower bound in the new Keynesian model has had some really striking results. One of them is that although most models have a small government spending multiplier, in the zero lower bound, the literature reports that the government spending multiplier can be huge. Additionally, while most people would say that, well, it may be in a crisis state that firms are more willing to adjust their prices, and so the nominal rigidity that makes the government spending multiplier large in the first place, which is the zero lower bound, may be less important, it turns out that in these models, when you make prices more flexible, you actually get larger government spending multipliers. So similarly, the literature reports that the output collapse at the zero lower bound can be huge, and additionally, it's worse when prices get more flexible. So we view these as really striking results in the literature. But then some recent papers that take those models and analyze them non-linearly have found actually that there are at least two equilibria when the zero lower bound binds. So Mertens and Robin have a paper, and Braun, Korber, and Waukee also analyze a model very similar to ours in a fully nonlinear setting. One of the equilibria that these studies find has the properties that I just discussed, the large government spending multipliers and so forth. The other one typically has very different properties, and we need some way to be able to think about those different properties. Now, the existing literature didn't find this other equilibrium that has very different properties, and that's really just a figment of the linearization strategy that literature uses in order to solve the model. But multiple equilibria in this context is a huge problem if we want to understand what's happened while the nominal interest rate has been at its effective lower bound. In particular, if we want to understand things like the government spending multiplier, the cyclicality of real wages, we need to understand how to define some of these objects in the context of multiple equilibria, and that's really hard to do if we have multiplicity. So what we do in this paper is we argue that stability under learning can be a way to select a unique equilibrium at the zero lower bound. And I'll go into exactly what I mean by that. But what we show is that the equilibrium has the striking properties that have already been stressed in the new Keynesian literature about the zero lower bound. We're going to reconcile our findings with previous work, and because previous work, particularly Mertens and Robin, have concluded that learning is not an effective way to select an equilibrium in this context. And what we're going to argue is that we have a slightly different approach to learning that may in fact do it for us. Mertens and Robin are going to follow the standard approach in the literature, which is really following Evans and Honkapoya, and we're going to argue that that approach is incomplete. So the first question that we need to address is, why should you care about stability under learning at all if we have multiple rational expectations equilibria? Well, rational expectations models typically assume that agents within the model have an extraordinary amount of information about both the structure of the model and the information sets of other agents. And I think that we all sort of hope that these models are useful abstractions for thinking about a world in which those stark assumptions aren't met exactly. And that hope has been expressed by a host of authors before us, going all the way back to Lucas in '78. So suppose that a rational expectations equilibrium wasn't stable if agents have slight errors in the way they form expectations. And what I mean by that is, suppose that agents form expectations in a way that's close to the rational expectations way of forming expectations, but they're just a little bit off. And then also suppose that prices and quantities diverge from the rational expectations prices and quantities. In that case, we don't think the equilibrium would be empirically interesting because it's unlikely that we would ever see that rational expectations equilibrium in the data. And so it's this perspective that's going to guide our analysis of the new Keynesian model at the zero lower bound. So the model is going to be just a really small version of the model that Larry just presented. It's a standard new Keynesian model. We're going to analyze it fully nonlinearly. We have this representative household, monopolistically competitive firms that are going to face price adjustment costs in the vein of Rottenberg. We have a government that's setting an interest rate according to a Taylor rule, except when it's constrained by the zero lower bound, and they're also consuming. In an appendix, we perform a nonlinear analysis of the same model with Calvo pricing frictions. We get the same results. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'll just use Rottenberg for convenience. So to analyze the zero lower bound, as in Egerton and Woodford, we're going to assume that there's an increased desire to save. And we're going to model that as a decrease in the discount rate, which here I'm going to call RT. So what I'm going to say is that at time zero, RT is equal to some value, RL, which is lower than its long-run value, which I call RH. RT in every period has the probability that it'll jump back to RH with probability 1 minus P, and RH is going to be an absorbing state. So once it jumps back to RH, it's there forever. Equilibrium quantities of consumption, CT, and inflation, pi t, are going to return to a steady state value once RT goes back to RH, and we can do that because the model doesn't have any state variables. So we're going to denote the values of consumption and inflation while we have this decreased discount rate that are the equilibrium quantities as CTL and pi TL. And what the new Keynesian model really gives us is a mapping from expectations about future consumption and future inflation to current consumption and current inflation. And I'm simplifying a lot here, but basically we have an intertemporal Euler equation, a pricing equation, and a resource constraint that you can represent just as a nonlinear system of equations. And the important thing is that households and firms need to form expectations about these future aggregate quantities in order to make decisions today. Now, in a rational expectations equilibrium, the equilibrium quantities CL and pi L are just a fixed point of this mapping, because households know that in the next period, this would be the quantities of consumption and inflation that we would have if we remain at the zero lower bound. When we have rational expectations, these equilibrium conditions collapse to a single equation in pi L that we represent here as F that has to equal 0. And so what I can do is I can plot for you in this very simple environment that function f. And the two red dots represent rational expectations equilibria. So those are values of inflation at the zero lower bound that satisfy the nonlinear system of equations that is represented by the new Keynesian model. So both of those are valid rational expectations equilibrium, and the question is, how do we choose one? What we're going to ask is, are both of those stable to small deviations from rational expectations? And to do that, we have to make some assumption about the way agents form beliefs in the model. And so what we're going to say is that they form beliefs, which we denote with this superscript E, by just assuming that tomorrow's consumption and tomorrow's inflation look a lot like yesterday's consumption and yesterday's inflation. And we think this is a particularly reasonable assumption because in a rational expectations equilibrium, this is exactly true. So the question we want to ask is, how do equilibrium values of consumption and inflation evolve while we have this reduced discount rate if agents form expectations that aren't quite the rational expectations values? So what I can do for you is plot a phase diagram of initial conditions for the expectations in consumption and inflation at the zero lower bound. And it plots for you how the equilibrium quantities of consumption and inflation evolve if we just let the system go forward. And what you can see is that this rational expectations equilibrium in the upper right is an absorbing state, in that there are a whole bunch of starting values where the economy will converge to that rational expectations equilibrium. The equilibrium in the lower left, on the other hand, is a repelling state, in that if you start arbitrarily close to it, eventually the system will go arbitrarily far away or to the other equilibrium. So the important result here is this high consumption, higher inflation equilibrium is stable. The low consumption, lower inflation equilibrium is repelling. And so from our perspective, we conclude that the low consumption equilibrium is not empirically interesting as a rational expectations equilibrium. Importantly, at the stable equilibrium, the government spending multiplier is large, the multiplier is bigger the more flexible our prices, and the output collapse is worse when prices are made more flexible. So all of those really stark results that we saw from the literature on the new Keynesian model in the zero lower bound remain true at our unique stable equilibrium. An important feature that we need to consider, though, is the speed of divergence from this other rational expectations equilibrium. At the unstable equilibrium, in our model, divergence is extremely rapid, which means that if you start close to but not exactly at the rational expectations equilibrium, you move far away very quickly. If divergence from the unstable equilibrium were slow, the unstable equilibrium might well be empirically interesting because we may stay in a neighborhood of that equilibrium for a very long time. And that's in fact what Mertens and Robin have shown. They find that divergence from the unstable equilibrium is slow in the context of their model and their learning environment. This is in sharp contrast to our result. And the reason for the difference really has to do with an assumption about the way that learning happens. In Mertens and Robin's paper, each firm chooses its price knowing the aggregate of all other firms' prices. And I want to stress that this is the standard approach in the learning literature that follows Evans and Hankapoya. Obviously, though, firms can't literally know the aggregate price level or the value of all other firms' prices while they're simultaneously choosing what their prices are going to be. There's a bit of a timing issue there. So what we do is we change the assumption, and we say that instead, each firm has to choose its price based on a belief about the aggregate of all other firms' prices. And then if and when those firms are wrong, they update their belief. And it turns out that by changing the learning environment to this environment, which we think is more complete, we get this result that we have very fast divergence from the unstable equilibrium. So just to let me conclude, many macro models have multiple rational expectations equilibria in the new Keynesian literature. And we, in this paper, consider that phenomena specifically at the zero lower bound. If we require that rational expectations equilibria are robust to small deviations from rational expectations, then we find that we can focus on a unique equilibrium at the zero bound, and it has all of those sort of surprising features that I outlined at the beginning. Additionally, we find that divergence from our unstable equilibrium is very fast. This requires us to make a change to the learning literature. Just let me conclude by saying that this analysis, we think, is a reminder of a much broader research agenda, which is that it's important to understand how actual agents actually form beliefs when we think about these rational expectations models. And so in that context, we think that it's okay to focus on the prescriptions from the new Keynesian literature at the zero lower bound that have been surprising. Thanks.
Okay, this works. So thanks a lot to the presenters. I think we have time for a few quick questions if anybody has it. I'm not going to run much over the time because, of course, there's the dinner coming up. But if there were any quick questions, we could have a couple. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Mr. Christiano about the role of the TFP shock in your model. So I just wondered, obviously you've got a big fall in output, you've got the labour market characteristics. I guess if you're putting in a TFP shock, does that not take you quite a long way, almost by definition? So, what are the features? But you seem to suggest that actually financial market shocks are playing a greater role. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, we find the TFP, the financial shocks are affecting demand and aggregate output. And they don't have, surprisingly, they don't have such a huge effect on inflation. The TFP shock, though, does. And I don't know what you meant by definition. I mean, it's true that when the TFP goes down, that raises costs, and that puts upward pressure on inflation, if that's what you meant by definition.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, if it were a pure labour productivity shock, I understand that it's a TFP shock rather than that. But then
labor costs are a large portion of costs in the model. Well, no, it's both labor and capital costs. So either way, it's the same. The efficiency condition defines the marginal cost either as the cost of a unit of capital divided by the marginal product of capital, or the cost of a unit of labor divided by the marginal product of labor. That gives you the same exact measure of marginal cost. In both cases, the denominator term, when TFP goes down, marginal productivity goes down, and makes output, it makes cost go up. And whether you think about cost as coming from capital or labor.
Because it is stable, and all the paths which converge, all converge to the steady state. So you have unique. So I'm just confused out there. Once you this equilibrium, you'll get sunspots and other behavior around that steady state. So once you actually get a shock, and what can you say about the predictions when you have sunspots and other phenomena around the steady state?
In the context of the equilibrium that we're considering at the zero bound, I think it actually is locally determinate in rational expectations setting. And what we show is that if we have the style of learning that we impose, that it converges to that rational expectations equilibrium.
But all the paths in the neighborhood are all converging because it's sync. They're all converging to the steady state.
Yeah, so there are a lot of, depending on what people's initial expectations are, there are all those paths that go into the steady state. The indeterminacy that Ben was just referring to was the property of the rational expectations equilibrium. Those are determinate. They're two and they're determinate. In terms of the learning equilibria, I guess if you define indeterminacy there, I'm not sure about this, if you define indeterminacy there, we do find many learning equilibria indexed by the initial expectation, and I guess if you want to call that indeterminacy, then I think that would be in the spirit of how we define indeterminacy of an equilibrium.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure where that goes.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking that if you have a shock, and then you deviate from your steady state equilibrium, then what can you say about the path converging back to the steady state? Because you have many paths from each point. Do you have a unique path which converges back to steady state?
Well, actually, in our model, there's a unique path because, Ben didn't mention this, but when we actually simulate the model, we have people forming their expectations about what they most recently saw. And the way we do the analysis is we imagine that the economy was in a steady state before when there's no zero lower bound, and no one was expecting that this saving shock would occur and you'd fall into the zero lower bound. So actually, when we consider equilibrium, there is only one. There's only one learning equilibrium, which is you start with the initial expectation that life was going to be in the future like what it had been, and then the shock occurs, you fall into the zero lower bound, and their beliefs are violated. They have to update their beliefs, and we do get a unique path. What Ben showed was, in terms of his thing, was that if you start here, this is what happens if you start there. But actually, in our model analysis, given that the way we model expectations, there is exactly one equilibrium.
Okay, I think unfortunately, given the time, we need to stop here. So let's thank all the speakers for some very interesting talk.